Welcome to another BBA Roundtable discussion. Today we're going to explore the Building Safety Act and specifically the construction supply chain's expectations post-implementation. So Nick, please, could you start us off with how do you see the industry in terms of that expectation versus the reality on the ground?
I have to start from the fact that we haven't yet got our new legislation, but I think in terms of an expectation and a requirement is we need, as the regulator, we need stakeholders, the industry, to talk to us, to collaborate with us, so that we can work together. I think that is an overriding expectation of collaboration, so that together we can identify what really are the priorities and put our resources into the right things. As well as collaboration, we've got, the supply chains are complicated within this sector in terms of things moving through supply chains from manufacturers, distributors, suppliers, importers, through to the installation and the specification at the beginning of the process. So communication and cooperation are two other big expectations and requirements, that people throughout those chains communicate and cooperate. Otherwise, the risk isn't going to be managed, and it is going to be for the different regulators, as OPSS for the construction product, for the building safety regulator in England, and other regulators to pick up the pieces. So collaboration, communication, cooperation, and competence. That is another big area where there is an expectation and a need for, people to recognise and embrace the need, to upskill on those things, so that all parties in the system understand how they can influence change and improvement.
Sure. And you mentioned the word competencies. Bill, let's bring you in here from BBA's perspective. How important is that?
Competence is absolutely vital, it underpins everything we do. And obviously at BBA we've got a set of competencies that we use in assessing construction products. But let's just think through the life of a product. It's made, it's handled, it's moved, it's stored, it's brought to site, it's put into a building, or it's designed into a building at some point. Not the product in its reality, but it's in the design process, it's thought about as being integrated. So is it integrated correctly? Is it then on site, built in accordance with the design? And then when the job is finished off, is it then maintained into the future? All of these things have to happen. So a product, in the sense of a physical object, is only, let's say, a quarter of the story. It's how it's all these other things, particularly how it's designed and integrated with other products, and then how it's brought onto the site and used and installed. And we've got representatives of the construction supply chain here are absolutely vital. So competence needs to underpin all of these things. Perhaps if I can echo some of the things Nick said, but also add to those. I think it is very welcome today that we're a group of people with day jobs having this discussion. And dare I say it, there's a lot of groups around that like to debate these points, but I don't see quite so much involvement on the day-to-day from people who are manufacturers, who are the regulator or the builder in the industry. And I think that sort of discussion is something that needs to be liberated, brought to the fore, so that you're having a really meaningful, gritty conversation about what is in the day-to-day and is happening. And the vernacular needs to change. There's a lot more I could say. Perhaps we'll come back around the table. I'll just park it there for a minute.
Yeah, no, sure. And I'd like to hear the voices of the two of you, James and David, representing the building industry on the ground, so to speak. So, James, I'm going to come to you first. Is there a gap? Where is the gap between that implementation and the reality on the ground?
I think there is. If you depend on the view you take, the industry is accustomed to being told through legislation, do this, particularly with building regs or approved documents more specifically. Do this, that allows you to comply, and here's a transition. So that's quite open ordinarily, and the industry have come quite familiar with that process. What do I need to do? When do I need to do it? I'm going to adjust. The tact being applied now industry-wide is, we're not going to do that. You're a big enough industry, you need to drive some of this yourself. So I'm not going to come and tell you exactly what constitutes the golden thread per se. I'm not going to tell you a new minimum standard, right? It needs to be bespoke to the project. And you need to evidence what you've done to demonstrate that works. So it is a shift. So one part of the industry is in direct conflict with the other, where you've got some people who are aspirational trying to drive that. But the reality is it probably won't pick enough traction up because people are still waiting to be told what to do. So they're nervous about investing time, money at the overall impact on profits of an organisation on a very complex time where the industry's been hit in multiple different areas, which is squeezing those margins of, I don't know if I want to be that person at the cutting edge, right? And what that might mean from an exposure perspective.
So sure. So David, can I ask you to step in there? Do you agree with what James is saying?
I do. Yeah, sure. I think the construction industry is hugely aware. Grenfell, as awful it is a massive advert for the business needs to change. The construction industry needs to change the way we stipulate products on projects, the way those products are installed. As Bill said, the journey that we go through before we hand the building over needs to change. There's no question at all about that. But I think, as James is alluding to, who's going to lead that change? And there is no point in having a pile of legislation that sits out the back as a big stick to beat us up with it, because we're contractors. We'll come up with devious ways of answering the question, and we won't all come up with the same answers. And I think really what the industry needs to do is the industry needs to collaborate, communicate, and come up with the right solution. And I go back to my sort of history of my career and the sea change that went about with the change in health and safety. And 20, 30 years ago, you turn up on a construction site in a flat cap and a pair of shorts and a flip-flop may not look particularly brilliant, but there were no standards or whatever. Nowadays, it's absolutely mandatory. People wear 5-point PPE on a construction site. And that cultural change needs to happen. It needs to happen exactly the same way. How's that going to get driven? It's going to get driven by clear, defined guidance on what it is that we need to do to get there. I think we're on the journey. I think there's a clear path that we're going to go forward on it, but we need to get through the legislation and stuff like that and start giving some more upstream guidance back into the industry so the industry can as a whole move in the right direction. I don't think it will be driven by the construction industry itself.
Right. Neil, what would you like to add from a regulatory perspective?
I really strongly agreed with Dame Judith Hackitt's view that the regulations are complicated and need to be read by informed, competent people, but that actually government have provided too much information and that the industry should know best. Dame Judith was very familiar with how the chemical industry and other high-risk industries worked and expected that industry to provide its own standards because it understood its own risk best. And I don't think that's been converted yet into reality. I don't see the approved documents changing and being slimmed to echo back to standards from organisations that truly know how their systems should be used in buildings.
Sure, and this sounds like a very common thread of thought here. So Bill, is that going to be the answer, that the industry creates its own destiny in terms of direction with this, rules? And
I think there's some interesting things to think about here. One of the things in the Hackitt report was very much about modern methods of construction or modular construction as being a good way forward. So de-risking the construction site to a large degree and getting the risk into a repeatability in an environment where you're in. There's a lot of initiatives at the moment around platforms and platform standards. So something we're thinking about is if you're going to certify a product, what environment are you certifying it for, and what does that mean? So if you certify it as fit for purpose within a given platform, so someone's defining very clearly with their platform what they want from it, you don't actually need the building regulation, well, not the approved documents at all, in a kind of very theoretical way of speaking. So that becomes quite interesting, and that's very much the platform owner then taking ownership of the definition of what's needed in order for the platform to be safe. So I quite like turning it round that way as a way of thinking. But I suppose if I'm going to make a selfish point here, one of the analyses we've done at BBA is to think about roughly what percentage of the value of a building is certified and has third-party certification, whether it's by BBA or anyone else. We came up with a figure somewhere around 12 to 15%. So, hey guys, what about the other 85%? So, you know, we're open to business, obviously. I make that point, slightly tongue-in-cheek. But, you know, thinking about it from the other end of the telescope, your assurance, whatever you're looking for, maybe would be helped along a long way, Nick, if there was that greater level of certification. Is that what you think?
Yeah. I mean, but I think what we have to recognise, I mean, it illustrates the how the issues are only going to be solved on a bigger picture level, I think, because what it illustrates is how we can't look purely at the building regs and building standards in isolation. The construction product regulations are about providing safe products with clear and accurate information into the built environment so that the correct product can be selected. Once it gets into the design phase and is incorporated into systems and buildings, that then moves from our remit at OPSS into building control and building safety regulator territory. But the line of sight is the product information, which is based on a risk assessment that the product manufacturer's done, testing and certification, and providing clear and accurate information to allow the correct decisions to be made. So I agree, but what it shows is how the system has to work together as a whole, all the players, all the regulators, and the point you made at the beginning of this bit of the discussion, Bill, was the fact that it's by all people sitting around the table, not just manufacturers and building designers and installers. It's recognising that risk will arise in different bits of the supply chain, and to stop it passing down, those players have got to work together. Don't know if that answers your question. Apologies if it doesn't.
But Nick, you're right. You know, you raised some really interesting points there, and again, that thread of your reply really was about product certification. So let's bring in the manufacturers. Is there a gap between implementation and reality for you two representing manufacturers? What do you think, Paul?
I think probably the information's always been there. It's getting it into the right people and collaborating. That's been the key point from this. Is making sure that you're giving people that understanding. So we've dealt with the BBA for a number of years and making sure that the information that's going there is accurate. It gives the end user what they need out of it to make sure that they're making the key decisions from it. That needs to continue. It's like you say, it's not on every product. There should be a way, if it's through third-party accreditation, if it's covered by a harmonised standard. There isn't enough test houses for us to work at the moment. That's something that we're finding, that we can't get all of our products certified if it's not through a third party. Obviously, from a CE marking UKCA, that's an issue we've had the last couple of years, the guidance on that and where you can actually test. If it's not covered by the test houses we tend to use, there's a very limited number. So I think that needs to change. But going back to the collaboration, we are seeing that people are trying to collaborate with us. If it's from an architect's perspective, firstly, they want to know more. So I think the willingness is definitely there. It's just carrying that on for the years to come.
So Tim, with the willingness being there, and sometimes there being a lack of places with which to get products certified, is that a limiting factor for you, do you think, or for the industry as a whole, actually?
Yeah, I think it is, and certainly when we look at the fire situation post Grenfell, there was a clamour for test houses and for testing of particular materials like we supply, not only in the UK but all over the world. But I think testing our products is only part of the problem. I think if we just go back to the original question about expectations, I think collaboration, communication, and competency that Bill discussed is really, really important. One point that James made is about in the past the construction industry has been sort of allowed, if you like, to sort of find its own way and set its own standards. The one output of that, I think, negative output of that in the past, and it was demonstrated in the Hackitt report, was there was a lack of clarity about roles and responsibilities within the construction industry. And so trying to tie those 2 points together, if I go and test my product to a certain standard, no two buildings are the same. There will come a point on a particular project where the testing that I've done with the BBA or the testing that I've done in a fire institute doesn't fit that building perfectly. And at some point, someone then has to take responsibility for how that project goes forward. And I think that's incumbent on the whole construction industry. That's where people have not, I think, or companies, individuals have in the past have not stepped up and had that collaboration that Nick talks about to find the perfect solution. And what happens then is that issues fall through the gaps. So if we are to take the Building Safety Act as this seismic shift within the construction industry, and if we are as an industry to interpret it and move forward as the government require, and I think as I would agree with David, as certainly most of the industry want to do, then that collaboration is absolutely vital. And the collaboration leads to people taking responsibility for their own part of that chain. And I think if we don't have that clarity on roles and responsibility, people taking responsibility, the regulators enforcing those gateways, which apparently are going to be hard stops, which I think we would all welcome. We can't go any further forward until this part of the building or the design is absolutely bottomed out. If we can get to that and we can get to a culture within the industry of everybody having the same attitude, then I think we've got a really good chance. And that's certainly our expectation should be there right now. We should expect that, but it's a big long shift in culture to get there.
Sounds very positive. Anything anybody would like to add? Any
And a
thoughts?
huge commitment, I think.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, to me, you mentioned, you know, we talk about the golden thread. To me, the hard stop is without one question of a doubt, the stop point, hold point, and call it what you like, is what we want as a contractor, a mature client, to come back to us and say to us, we've already gone through due diligence, we've already analysed the risks that we can see in there, we've apportioned those risks to the correct people to hold them and all the rest of it. We've reached that point, we can now sanction and sign off and give you our IBA stage 4 design or whatever it is that we're going to be handing across to you, and that is now a valid, viable product for us to build. Whereas as a contractor, I know 95% of the projects that we get given, inverted commas, with that on it, that is not the fact. You know, it doesn't take us very long to go through and rip it to pieces and go back and say, well, guys, it doesn't stand the test of time, it doesn't stand buildability, it doesn't stand any other questions and queries. And, you know, well done for picking a product. Stowe Render, thank you very much indeed for specifying it, but you realise that you specified it completely out width of what it says in the Stowe products manual. And have you spoken to Stowe, for example, and got them to sanction and satisfy and validate the design that you put in place? It doesn't happen. And I think, you know, that to me is hopefully where this act is going to take us all. The regulations will drive that behaviour within the upstream designers and clients to make sure that, yeah, when they do pass this information across to us, we have achieved a hard stop. We have got...
Yeah, no, I'm saying, do conversations like this around the table, cross-industry, are they part of the solution in terms of driving to that goal?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think I definitely want to expand on the point just made. We design and build a bespoke building every time. Make no mistake, you know, people might have types, but the ground conditions will shift from plot to plot. So that will introduce some nuances from one building to the next. And as a client procuring a design and the build parts, I want and should expect to see a design that works within the testing capabilities and the products, the manufacturers supporting the design team to provide that back to back. So if an element of design is not in accordance with that testing regime, I expect the manufacturer to step up to the plate and say, this is my evidence and justification of why it works in that very bespoke circumstance, right? So they take accountability of that. And I think that needs to continue all the way through to a product gets put on a building, it becomes part of a system, no longer the responsibility of the OPSS. I would challenge that from a PR perspective, because if something goes wrong, God forbid, in that system, I think it would be very difficult for people to defend oh, but it's no longer a product now, it's forms part of a system. So that changes the way that product performs. I don't think that's acceptable. I don't think that meets the expectation of the end user who's just bought a product. Right?
James, what you're right, and what it's worth me clarifying is that the new legislation will recognise that, because under the Building Safety Act and the bit on the construction product regulations, there will be a general safety requirement that requires the manufacturer to identify the foreseeable uses and misuses of the product, and and if that is going to be that it's likely and foreseeable that it's going to be incorporated in a system, then they need to risk assess the risks that could arise from that incorporation, and make sure that the designer, the specifier and the installer and the project manager have got that information to know how to mitigate those risks in site. So I agree, there is a link. Yes, it falls into a different legislative framework and a different built environment regulator, but the line of sight is that product information and the product manufacturers, what will be a duty to ensure that it's safe, ensure that it's been risk assessed, to make sure that accurate information can pass on. So the different elements are going to be hopefully better linked. Yes, it might be a product that becomes a system that gets incorporated, but as it passes from regulatory bit of the framework to the next bit, it will join up. So I don't think you need be concerned that we will have that regulatory gap, because that gap is one of many gaps that we're looking to plug.
But the point that James makes is very, very, very true. No building is ever the same. No structure, nothing at all. There is always some dynamic that changes.
How often are those products bespoke? Yes, they might be tweaked and modified, and they might be applied in a different building design. And yes, it might be a slightly modified version. It might be different, but the products, my interest is the products that are placed on the market for designers to choose and end users to incorporate. Their building design might be bespoke, but it is very rare that building will be made of 100% one-off bespoke products. Some of them will be, and there clearly will have to be a lot of collaboration. But the new legislative framework plugs a gap where currently only 444 product types are covered by the current construction product regulations. If there isn't a designated standard, they fall out of the mandatory framework. Right. In the future, anything that constitutes a construction product and is placed on the market will have to have been considered, been risk assessed, been thought about, have accurate and clear product information. So I accept, that each building might be bespoke, but I don't accept that the products that feed into it are necessarily therefore unique and bespoke in their own right.
And on that point, it's an active discussion, I'm sure, that will continue. Thank you all.